Hello and welcome to my weekly podcast, which I call Through the Bible in 10 Years. We are in Acts. We are over halfway through the book of Acts, although very soon we're going to be taking more and more detours. So today we're going to do Acts chapter 17. Next week we're going to do the first part of Acts 18. But midway through Acts 18, we are going to begin to take detours into Paul's writings, and that is Paul's writings at the time when he wrote them. And so next week we get to Corinth, and Paul wrote First Thessalonians and Second Thessalonians, most believe, or many believe, from Corinth. And so we're going to take a detour after next week and do First and Second Thessalonians. And so today we are in Acts 17. Paul starts off in Acts 17 at Thessalonica. And so that's where we're going to begin this week. So we're making progress as we make it through the New Testament. We're going to now begin to take detours into Paul's writings pretty extensively. Acts 17. So Paul, in Acts 16 ends with Paul in Philippi. So Paul starts his second missionary journey with Silas. We have reason to believe that Titus is with him, and he picks up Timothy at Lystra, and they make their way across what we would now call Turkey. Of course, back then it was Asia Minor, and it was Greek-speaking and under the Roman Empire. The Lord leads them to Troas on the coast, and that's where Luke, we call the author Luke. We don't know for sure who the author of Acts is, but we'll say Luke for convenience. Paul picks up Luke at Troas. They go to Philippi, and that's where you'll notice that we no longer have we after we start Acts 17. So we assume that Luke stayed at Philippi and stays there for a number of years, actually. The year that we're in is about the year AD 50. So Paul does his first missionary journey, say from 46 to 48. And then we have the Jerusalem Council in 49 and the blow up at Antioch. And then Paul starts his second missionary journey about the year 50 or 49-ish, somewhere in there. So Paul comes to Philippi. You'll remember he gets in trouble there. He casts a demon out of a slave girl, and then she can't tell the future anymore, or can't at least soothsay, whatever it is you want to say she does, evil prophecy. And so this makes her owners very upset because they make a lot of money off of her. And so they get thrown into jail. There's an earthquake. The jailer is afraid they're going to escape and he'll be killed, but instead they witness to him. He becomes a Christian. His family is baptized. But Paul and Silas and Timothy and Titus leave Philippi, and they come to the next place, going west along the Via Egnatia, which ran along that coastline of Macedonia, north of Greece. And they come to Thessalonica, which is the chief city of the region and the armpit of where Macedonia and Greece kind of hit, little triangle. I guess I need to reverse it for the video. And that's where we pick up in verse 1. So having passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, these are smaller towns, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews, a gathering of the Jews. Could have been a building. Synagogue doesn't necessarily mean building, it means a gathering. So we don't know, for sure if it's a synagogue building or just a gathering place. Could have been a building. But they come to a synagogue of the Jews. Again, interestingly, there wasn't such a place in Philippi, apparently. They ended up going to the river for some reason. Maybe because Claudius had kicked the Jews out of Rome and therefore out of Roman colonies, although I doubt it somewhat. Verse 2. Now, according to the custom of Paul, he went into them, and for 3 Sabbaths he reasoned with them from the scriptures. So this is about a 2-week time period. Now, from Philippi, he mentions how while he was at Thessalonica, the Philippians had sent him care packages more than once. So probably Paul was in Thessalonica longer than just 2 weeks. He was probably there, maybe a couple months. But he doesn't last very long in the synagogue. And this is his pattern. Makes perfect sense that he would start off preaching Jesus in the synagogues. And this would only usually last for so long, because eventually those who were in charge of the synagogue often did not believe. Now, in Corinth, some of the leaders of the synagogue did believe. He still ends up having to leave the synagogue, but some of the chief leaders do believe in Corinth. Here at Thessalonica, he doesn't last very long in the synagogues. So he reasoned with them from the scriptures about Jesus. Verse 3, opening and putting forth that it is necessary for the Christ, for the Messiah, to have suffered and to rise from the dead, and that this is the Christ, namely Jesus, whom I am preaching to you. Now, this idea that the Messiah would suffer and die was not an idea that was particularly made sense to Jews. They did not think of the Messiah's suffering. I know we think, well, Isaiah 53, they didn't read Isaiah 53 that way. Jews, there is no evidence. Now, there is a fragment of a Dead Sea Scroll that some argued might indicate a suffering Messiah. But I would say the majority of scholars would say that there is no evidence at all that any Jew prior to Jesus expected the Messiah to die. That simply was not Messiah's win. Amy Grant, what was that song? El Shaddai. Though the people couldn't see what Messiah ought to be, they didn't get it. It does not compute, does not compute. They had no idea that the Messiah would die for sins. That simply wasn't part of what they expected a Messiah to do. And so Paul had his work cut out for him to convince people not only that Jesus was a Messiah who didn't kick the Romans out of Jerusalem, but that he was a Messiah who died for sins. That just didn't compute with the way Jews thought about the Messiah. They thought of the Messiah as a king, a human king. They didn't think of him as being God incarnate either. This puzzled me for a long time, how they could have thought that Judas the Galilean or Theudas or the Egyptian, how they could have thought these people could have possibly been the Messiah. Didn't they know the Messiah is God come to earth? But that's not the way they thought about it. They didn't think of the Messiah as going to be God come to earth. So we think, well, why didn't they understand? But this was a very controversial and revolutionary concept, the idea that the Messiah would die. Verse 4. Now some of them obeyed and cast their lot in with Paul and Silas, and a multitude of the worshiping Greeks, both women, the first women of the city, and not a few. This is an interesting phenomenon. We find it with Judaism too, that a lot of times wealthy women would be attracted to Judaism. Even we find murmurings about this in Roman literature, even in the late first century. And there were some of the prominent women of the city who believed, who not only were worshiping the God of Israel, so they were God-fearers, worshipers, Greeks who worshiped in the synagogue, but they believed on Jesus and joined themselves to Paul and Silas. So we get some who believe, and this is, I think, something that that is very likely, is that some of the many of the earliest Christians were probably what we call God-fearers. That is, that some of the readiest converts to Christianity were people who believed in the God of Israel. They had joined themselves to the synagogue, and this message, of course, you could see would be very attractive to them, especially Greek men or Gentile men, because they didn't have to undergo circumcision to become a full member in Paul's teaching. By the way, some of you will know that I think that the book of Hebrews was primarily written to Gentile Christians. This is a little bit of a what? That doesn't make any sense. The reason it doesn't make any sense is because in our world we think of Judaism and Christianity as distinct, but Gentile converts to Christianity in the first century would have seen themselves as joining Judaism. They would have seen themselves as joining true Judaism. And many of the earliest followers, I believe, were Gentile God-fearers. And so all of the material in Hebrews would have been just as relevant and comprehensible to a Gentile uh, Jew, as it were, Gentile Jew, a Gentile believer, as it would be to a Jewish believer. This is part of the paradigm shift, I think, but when we because we're thinking in terms of today and Judaism and Christianity being distinct religions, we're not thinking the way that it was back then. Well, okay. Verse 5. Now the Jews, having become jealous, now again, remember, Paul is a Jew. And so now Luke, if Luke is the author of Acts, he is a Gentile. From Colossians 4, he's in the part of the greeting in Colossians 4 that is non-Jews. And so we can, Luke has a tendency to refer to the Jews when he really means the non-believing Jews. And I think that's important because, again, this is part of why we unthinkingly assume that you had Christians and you had Jews. No, Paul saw himself as an Israelite. He says so himself. Now, the Jews being jealous, having taken certain certain men, or having gone to certain evil men of the market goers and having made a crowd. Okay, so this is in the marketplace. We're going to find out soon enough that another one of Paul's techniques was what we call tent making. He would go to the marketplace and he would sell leather goods and tents that he would make. And while people were doing business with him or passing by, he would tell them about Jesus. This was one of his witnessing strategies. So he had his synagogue strategy to Jews, and then he had his marketplace strategy for non-Jews. And so the idea that certain wicked men of the marketplace goers might be a attack on Paul makes sense. So there's a crowd and set the city in uproar against Paul. By the way, there are places, clear places, we've already seen this in our trek through Acts, where Luke points to Jews as the culprit, where Paul himself does not, particularly at Damascus when he's let down in a basket. Luke blames Jews, Paul blames the Arab ethnarch under King Aretas. So if we'd have seen it, what we would have seen, I think, is a group of people in the marketplace raising a fuss about Paul. And I've also suggested my thesis to you of the idea that Paul seems to be able to stay longer in a place. As his ministry goes on, he manages to stay longer and longer at places. So Paul probably was a little bit of a controversial figure. I think of Jonah and, preaching fires coming. I see Paul possibly doing some of that. And so that there would be people in the marketplace who were angry with him for suggesting such things is not surprising to me. So these people, they set the city in an uproar, and having stood at the house of Jason, who I think was the leader, well, obviously he's a convert to the Christian movement. They were seeking them to bring out Paul to the people, but not having found them. So Paul's not home apparently. Silas isn't home. They seem to be staying at the home of this Jason. Not having found them, they dragged Jason and certain of the brothers before the politarchs, the city authorities, the rulers of the city. By the way, I think it was William Albright, who was a bit of an archaeologist, who in the early 20th century discovered that, in fact, at Thessalonica, the leaders of the city were called politarchs. Prior to Albright, there were classicists and such who said, politarch, what's that? That's not right. Luke didn't know what he was talking about. But in fact, William Albright did in fact vindicate Luke on this, that in fact the leaders of the city of Thessalonica were in fact called politarchs. So they come crying out saying, quote, these ones who have turned up the world, they've caused a fuss all over the world. These also here have arrived. Verse 7, whom Jason has received. And all these, contrary to the decrees of Caesar, they're acting contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is a different king, Jesus. Verse 8, and they stirred up the crowd of the politarchs when they heard these things. Verse 9, and having taken kind of something sufficient from Jason and from the rest, they let them go. I don't know if this is a bribe, but it's certainly a fine, maybe a fine, but basically Jason and them have to give something to get away. But here we begin to see here the fact that that it's true that Christianity was to some extent a seditious movement, because Christians believe that Jesus was king, not Caesar, and that's problematic. Now, Luke doesn't emphasize that. Paul doesn't emphasize that. This is not, they certainly do not present themselves as seditious to the Roman Empire. They're not trying to actively overthrow Roman officials or the Roman government. But this is fundamentally true, isn't it? It is. Jesus is king, not Caesar. Same thing here. The president is not king. Jesus is king. Jesus is Lord. The ruler of whatever land you happen to be in is not the ruler. Ultimately, it's God. And so there is an element of sedition involved in Christianity in the Roman Empire. Now, again, like I said, I think Paul goes out of his way in Romans 13. I think 1 Peter 3. These writings go out of or 1 Peter 2. These writings go out of their way to indicate that Christianity is not a danger to the emperor, that Christians pray for the emperor and Christians submit to the emperor. These are comments to make it clear that the Roman Empire should not be afraid of Christians, that is, the humans. But make no mistake, the Christians believed that when Jesus returned, the Romans were toast. Part of being the Messiah was that when Jesus came back to earth, he shall reign forever and ever. There will be no more Roman emperor to submit to once Jesus returns. Jesus is king, not Caesar. So this is a kind of a dance that they're doing, a fine line that they're walking, because in fact their theology does imply sedition, but they want to make it clear that that's when Jesus returns. For the time being, they're very nice model citizens. Well, okay, they didn't spend too much time at Thessalonica. We'll talk about this in a couple weeks. That there were some theological gaps left in their training. The church at Thessalonica was overwhelmingly Gentile, and so there were things that they just didn't know. And First Thessalonians addresses some of those things that they just didn't know. Well, for the time being, they leave Thessalonica. Verse 10. And the brothers immediately at night, they sent away both Paul and Silas to Berea, which is a little bit down south into Greece. We don't have any letters to Berea, unfortunately. That'd be nice, but we don't. And part of the reason we don't have letters to Berea might be the fact that it was a solid community. Paul's letters are clean up on aisle 6. Paul writes the letters he writes when there's a problem, and so Berea doesn't have a problem, and Paul doesn't write him a letter, as far as we know. Who, having arrived at Berea, into the synagogues of the Jews they went. Verse 9. Now these were more noble than those, the Jewish community in Thessalonica, who received the word with great intention and readiness, every day examining the scriptures, if these things would be so. Verse 12. Therefore, indeed, many, on the one hand of them, believed, both of the Greek women, prominent Greek women, and men, not a few. And so there's apparently a good crop of Christians, new Christians, out of the Jewish community and God-fearers at Berea. But as those from Thessalonica knew, Jews from Thessalonica knew, that also in Berea the word of God was proclaimed by Paul, they came also there, shaking and agitating the crowds. Verse 14, and immediately then the brothers sent Paul to go unto the sea, and they remained there, both Silas and Timothy, at the sea. Verse 15, but the ones escorting Paul brought him to Athens, and having received a command, having taken a command to Silas and to Timothy, that they might come to him quickly, they departed. Okay, so Paul has gone to Athens, a slight separation from Paul and Timothy, who are at the coast. So Paul's by himself in Athens for a little bit. Again, Paul doesn't seem to get to stay very long at a particular place yet. Corinth will be a breakthrough. He's able to stay at least a year and a half, maybe 2 years at Corinth. So that's a real breakthrough for Paul. So Timothy and Silas here aren't with Paul when he's at Athens. And so the rest of the chapter deals with Paul being at Athens. Of course, Athens is well known. If you've taken a little high school mythology and so forth, Athens was the center of Greece from our reckoning. Now, Sparta actually was stronger for a great deal of the time, but Athens, of course, has received a lot of attention to us in our Western education because in the Renaissance, Athens, and why? They were Italians, right? But in the Renaissance, European culture began to look back to Athens and Greek culture in Athens as the pinnacle of civilization prior to the Renaissance. I don't know, it's kind of at odds with the Christian heritage there. Early Christianity in Athens didn't necessarily have a lot to do with each other. The church eventually closed the academy, Plato's academy. What year was it? 500 and I forget exactly, 529, something like that. The church actually closed Plato's academy. Tertullian, a famous early Christian, about 200, he says, "What does Athens have to do with Christianity? What does the academy have to do with the church?" The Renaissance was a little bit controversial in, at least we might say it was, in looking back to Athens rather than and of course called the church age the Dark Ages, right? As if when Christianity took over, that was a darkness. But anyway, so Athens is of interest to us. Of course, Socrates was in Athens, Plato was in Athens, Aristotle was in Athens for a while, and then came back. So let's go ahead. Verse 16. Now in Athens, while Paul was waiting for them, his spirit was provoked in him when he saw how completely idolatrous the city was. 17. Therefore, he was reasoning in the synagogue to the Jews. So there are Jews, and there's a synagogue in Athens. There are Jews there, and to those who worship there. So he's doing his thing. He's meeting in the synagogue and in the marketplace every day with those who would chance upon him. And so he's doing his mission. He has his tent making marketplace ministry, and then he has his synagogue ministry. Verse 18. Now certain, both of the Epicureans and the Stoics, philosophers, they came upon him. And some of them were saying, what would want this babbler to say, this word sower, sower of words, this babbler, this person who blah, 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 throws a lot of words out there. What is he trying to say? Now, we know these Epicureans and Stoics, again, if you've studied philosophy, you know who these people are. The Stoics were so called because they met under a particular stoa or colonnade there at the marketplace. The Stoics believed that they actually came close in some of the things they said about the logos. The logos for them was the mind of the universe. And the Logos dictated everything that happened. And there's a hymn to Zeus, Zeus being a metaphorical expression of the Logos. There's a hymn to Zeus that sounds very Christian or Jewish, could easily be sung in church. This hymn to Zeus from a Stoic. I'm trying to remember who it was, Cleanthes or something like that, a couple hundred years before Christ. So the Stoics believed that there was a mind that governed the universe. They would have been fine with John 1, in the beginning was the Logos was with God, the Logos was God. They would be completely fine with that sort of imagery. They'd have looked, their eyebrows would have raised a little when you got to verse 14, the Logos became flesh. What are you talking about? But the Stoics believed a lot of things that were could easily be put together with Christianity. When Paul says in Philippians, I've learned to be content no matter my circumstances, if there were Stoics reading it, they'd have said amen. Stoics believed in loving the destiny that the God had set out for you. And so there were Stoics there. The Epicureans, on the other hand, were not particularly compatible with Christian or Jewish belief. Epicureans believed that everything that exists is matter. Even our souls are made up of matter, and that there is no afterlife. And when we die, all of our atoms, including our soul atoms, just go back into the ground, and somebody else gets our soul atoms, but not as a person. It's just life atoms. The Epicureans, Roman Epicureans, are the ones who said, "Eat, drink, and be merry, because tomorrow we die." Now, Epicurus himself, the Greek, he thought pleasure comes from contemplation. So he wasn't a party animal of that sort. He partied by thinking deep thoughts. But the Epicureans at the time of the Romans had become fraternity boys. And they were basically, there is no tomorrow, so let's have fun today. So these are people we know about, groups we know about. And there are some intersections between these groups' thinking and Paul's letters, and we'll talk about those when we get there. We get to 1 Corinthians 15, we'll mention the Epicureans again. When we get to Philippians, we'll mention the Stoics again. So these people want to know, what's this guy talking about? But let's continue on in verse 18. But there were others who thought he seems to be proclaiming strange demons, strange gods, because because Paul was proclaiming Jesus and the resurrection. Now, you weren't supposed to invent new religions. This is something the Romans weren't real happy about. There were plenty of gods already around. And so the idea of inventing new ones, Romans weren't so happy about cults, especially strange cults. They liked stability. They liked the same. They didn't like new stuff. And so, verse 19, and having taken hold of him, they brought him into the Areopagus, or into Mars Hill. Now, here we need to keep in mind that Mars Hill is where it was where the court was held. So this isn't just tell us some stuff, Paul. What are you talking about? Paul is on trial here, I think. It's kind of more like a hearing to decide whether he actually is trouble. And again, to proclaim the resurrection is to proclaim the upturning of history, the change of history. Revolution, as N.T. Wright says, is associated with resurrection. And so Paul is not just giving a lecture here. He's viewed with some suspicion. So they say, are we able to know what this new thing is, or what the teaching is being spoken by you? Because it sounds a little suspicious and seditious to us. Verse 20. Some strange things you are bringing into our hearing. We therefore want to know what these things are about, what these things wish to be. Verse 28. Now all the Athenians and strangers who visit, they did nothing but spend their time speaking and hearing new things. But again, I think this is more than just a lecture. I really do. If we read between the lines, I think this is a little bit of Paul could be in trouble. Got some splaining to do. Verse 22. And Paul, having stood in the midst of the Areopagus, he said, Men Athenians, in all things I see that you are very religious. I think the King James says superstitious. So he's going to play. This is well played, Paul. Well played. He is going to play on the fact that there are lots and lots of gods in the city of Athens, and for him to talk about the Jewish God is not for him to invent new gods. Verse 23. For passing through and beholding all of the things that you're worshiping, I found even an altar on which it has been inscribed to an unknown God. Now, he's doubly covered here, because even if they want to say, well, you're preaching Jesus, not the Jewish God, you guys even have an altar to the unknown God. And so I'm good. I'm not inventing new gods or anything like that. Therefore, whom not knowing you worship, this person I am announcing to you. Verse 24. The God who made the world and all the things that are in it, this one, being Lord of heaven and earth, he does not dwell in temples that are made by hands. Verse 25, nor by the hands of man is he served, because he's as if he needs something. For he himself gives to all life and breath and all things. Okay, well, he's basically saying, guess what? I'm proclaiming to you the God, the creator God. Now, of course, nothing he's saying here would have been particularly controversial because, of course, the Greeks believed in gods as creators. And of course, this fits very well with the Jewish God. So I think he's okay so far. But he's basically saying, you guys don't even know who the real God is, um, even though you worship lots of gods. Verse 26, and he made from one person, from Adam. Is that what he's saying here? And he made from one every tribe of men. From one person, he made every nation of men to dwell upon the face of the earth, having set apart appointed times and boundaries of their habitation. 27, so that they might seek God, if perhaps also they might touch him and might find him. And indeed, he is not far from each one of us. And so this, by the way, is a verse that is sometimes used in discussion of natural revelation. And that is to say that there is evidence in the universe, there's evidence in the world that might point us toward the Creator. And this is something, of course, that the Wesleyan tradition has generally believed. It's something that I believe. Now, there are Christian groups that, especially those who've come under the spell of Karl Barth, who don't think that natural revelation is a thing. But it's a thing. It may not be the only thing. It's not even the most important thing. But I think this verse suggests that it's a thing, although the optative case of Greek is used here. So it doesn't imply that they will for sure find him. It certainly doesn't imply that the evidence demands a verdict. But it does suggest that nature, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament his handiwork. That at least is a byproduct of this here. Verse 28, for in him we live and we move and we exist, as also some of the poets among you have said. For we are his kind, we are his offspring. He quotes the Stoic poet Aratus here. So he quotes the Stoics, quotes their poetry back to them. And of course, everything that he's said here so far would have been very much agreeable to a Stoic. And so you're doing good, Paul. Keep going. Verse 29. Therefore, being the offspring of God, we ought not to consider um, something of gold or silver or stone that's graven from a craft or the imagination of a human, we ought not think that to be like the divine. And again, the Stoics didn't think that the gods were literal, by the way. The Stoics believed that the myths were metaphorical, that Zeus was a metaphor. They didn't view the myths as actually beings. They didn't believe that Athena was a being. The Stoics believed that, many Stoics believed that these were just metaphors for aspects of the world. So you're doing good, Paul, from a Stoic perspective. Verse 30. Therefore, God, having overlooked the times of this ignorance before. So God has so far pretty much ignored the ignorance of the Gentiles on this, but now he is commanding all men everywhere to turn, to repent, to come to him. And so basically Paul is saying, you all need to wake up and realize that all of these stone and gold idols that you make, all these, even the temple of Athena, the Parthenon, there's no Athena in that temple. There is one God, the one who created everything. Of course, he hasn't said one here yet. Verse 31, but you all need to turn because he has established it. Now, here's where it gets controversial. He has established a day in which he is going to judge the world in righteousness. And he's going to do it by a man whom he appointed, that is Jesus. Jesus is the judge. Jesus is going to come. Now, here's where it's like, okay, you've kind of gone off the rail here, Paul. This is what they would have been thinking at this point, that God has set Jesus as the one who is going to come and judge the world for not properly worshiping him. This is where he's going to get in trouble with them, or could have. Having provided a guarantee to all by having raised Jesus from the dead. Now here, okay, you're cuckoo, Paul. This is what they would be thinking. Not all of them, but some of them. Verse 32. Now, when they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some began to mock him. Epicureans. So the Epicureans would have said, there's no resurrection of the dead. You're a crazy man. That's what the Epicureans would have thought. But others said, we will hear you again concerning this thing. And Stoics would have been, I'm not sure. I mean, I like a lot of what you're saying, Paul. Maybe want to hear you a little bit more. So mixed reaction. Verse 33. Paul thus, he went out from their midst. 34. But some men, having joined themselves to him, they did believe, among whom were Dionysius the Areopagite, maybe one of the judges, and a woman named Damaris, and others, different others with him. So not a lot of fruit at Athens. And some of course, there's an anti-intellectualism among a lot of evangelicals, and so they say, see, you can't get those intellectuals to believe anything, but I don't know that that's an implication of this chapter. Certainly Luke doesn't say anything like that, but it is true that Paul doesn't have a big crop of new Christians from Athens. We never hear again of a church in Athens in Paul's letters, that is. But he seems to be able to leave Athens without being thrown in jail this time. So that concludes Acts 17. We'll be back next week, Lord willing, with the first part of Acts 18 as we go through the Bible in 10 years.